And who was flickering the lights?
Hey, how's it going, YouTube? This is Devin with PubStompMTG, and with Innistrad Remastered basically getting spoiled here and there, I wanted to discuss a classic with Edgar Markov. This is one of the most infamous commanders because it has that ability of eminence. But now that it is getting reprinted in a couple different frames, which is quite crazy, I think there is the poster frame, the old border frame, and then the regular frame. So 3 different frames to choose from. And if you don't necessarily care, if you just want the original frame and just so that you can get the cheapest copy, more power to you. And many of you are probably building Edgar Markov for the first time because the price is going to drop significantly, or you might be a returning Edgar Markov player that is looking for more insight for your deck, and I have the video for you. And there are a couple different ways to build Edgar Markov. The most popular one, and obviously you're going to be building towards this way, is by using vampires. So that way you can flood the board with a bunch of vampires because of that eminence ability, and also buffing them up when you attack with Edgar. So this is going to be a mix between obviously vampires and aggressive strategy, and a little bit of aristocrats because vampires do very well in aristocrats package. And so now with that said, let's get started with the video. Let's talk about Edgar. Let's first discuss Edgar Markov himself and talk about the abilities he does have. For 3 red, white, and a black, so Mardu color combination commander, he's a legendary creature, vampire knight, and with a totally not busted eminence ability. Whenever you cast another vampire spell, if Edgar Markov is in the command zone or on the battlefield, you create a 1/1 black vampire creature token. He has first strike and haste. Whenever Edgar Markov attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control, and he has a 4/4 body. So now let's discuss why Edgar Markov is so good in Commander. Obviously, it's very powerful with that eminence ability. Whenever you cast a vampire, let's just say like a blood artist, you're essentially getting 2 creatures on the battlefield with the eminence ability. And that's why usually aristocrats packages are very good with Edgar Markov. However, I love the aggressive nature of Edgar. He has an immediate impact on the battlefield and honestly off the battlefield with the eminence ability. Again, I'm going to keep referencing that because it's quite insane. But the fact that whenever he does attack, you buff up all your vampires. So when you swing with a huge army of vampires, you buff them all up and go to town for some damage. And plus you can immediately use that when Edgar goes on the battlefield with a haste ability. And to move along into a different subject, I've actually never played an Edgar Markov deck, but I do have a friend that does play an Edgar Markov deck. Last time I played against it was like 3-4 years ago, and he geared it towards more CDH, more fringe CDH if anything else, where all he would do is cast a lot of cheap vampires to make an extra vampire token and try to get Razaketh on the battlefield and have a lot of sack fodder to basically tutor up a bunch of things. And he never really actually cast Edgar. The main point was just having that eminence ability, and that just tells you how busted this ability really is. Again, I don't believe Edgar is very CDH viable anymore nowadays because the format really sped up super fast and Edgar is pretty slow when it comes to it. And the only reason why I wanted to bring this up is because I just wanted to share my experiences playing against Edgar because I've actually never played Edgar myself. Again, without a question of a doubt, this is basically the de facto commander for vampires for sure. Obviously, there are some very popular vampire commanders, but Edgar is truly the king of vampires. And so now discussing Edgar Markov and talking about my experience with him, I now want to shift my focus and talking about building Edgar Markov and talking about some of the includes you should add in your deck. So first, I do want to talk about utility cards. I want to talk about these first before even diving into vampires, because these are what will help your deck function better whether you get card draw or ramp. And because you are in Mardu color combination, most likely you're going to have to rely on rituals in order to ramp out, for example, Edgar if you want to put him on the battlefield, or other vampires you want to choose. One option that is perfect for the deck is Master of Dark Rites. For 1 black mana, you tap it, sacrifice another creature, add 3 black mana, so it's essentially a dark ritual by sacrificing another creature, but you could only spend this mana only to cast vampire, cleric, and or demon spells. And since this is a vampire deck, this is a way where you could just sacrifice one of those little tokens you make off of Edgar and add 3 black mana. Not only that, Master of Dark Rites is only 1 black mana, so it's very cheap and effective, and when you do cast it, since it's just 1 mana, you'll make an extra token with Edgar's ability that you could just sacrifice after summoning sickness. Another way we could ritual out some vampires is by sacrificing them to other effects like Phyrexian Altar or even Ashnod's Node's Altar. Because we're making a lot of vampires on the battlefield, we can get that extra burst of mana by sacrificing them, either getting a mana of any color with Phyrexian Altar, or getting 2 colorless ones with Node's Altar. Again, there is really not too much options in Mardu color combination as far as ramp goes, so if you wanted to go a little bit more degenerate, Smothering Tithe can be your option to get a lot of treasure tokens when people draw cards. Speaking of card draw, Aristocrats is actually very good for card draw. One of the best card draw outlets in this entire deck that you must include is Skull Clamp. It's been getting reprinted here and there, but somehow the prices are still around 10 bucks, but there is a reason it is so good. For 1 mana, equipped creature gets +1/-1. Whenever equipped creature dies, draw 2 cards, and equip cost is 1. So basically, you know all those little 1/1s vampire tokens we're making off of Edgar Markov? Well, we could just pay 1 mana to equip them, and they'll immediately die, and of course when they die, we draw 2 cards. This is an insane outlet for card draw, and it doesn't necessarily need any more explanation on top of that, besides the fact that you're going to be drawing a ton of cards the more vampires you do have on the battlefield that at least have 1 toughness. Speaking of low cost creatures, Welcoming Vampire is another great option. Whenever 1 or more creatures with power 2 or less enter the battlefield under your control, you draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. For 3 mana, this is a decent card draw option. I like this because if we cast a bigger vampire, this ability will trigger because we get that extra 1/1 token copy with the Eminence ability. So this is just another way we could get some card advantage. But one underrated, and I absolutely mean this is seriously underrated, it is Plumb the Forbidden. For 1 and a black, as an additional cost to cast the spell, you may sacrifice 1 or more creatures. When you do copy the spell for each creature sacrificed this way, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. That 1 loss of life, especially when sacrificing a lot of creatures, may seem like a lot, but there is a lot of ways we could gain life and mitigate that life loss. And let's just say we have 5 vampire tokens on the battlefield, well, we could just sacrifice them all to Plumb the Forbidden and draw a fresh new 5 cards and lose 5 life. So to me, that is absolutely worth it in this kind of deck. It definitely scales with the more vampires you do have on the battlefield and the more that you're willing to sacrifice. So those are some of the great card draw options and ramp packages that you can choose from. I didn't want to dive into every single card that you could utilize. I only wanted to name some of the best options. I do have a deck list down below in the description if you want to see a more detailed list and see all the ramp packages and card draw, because of course I do have some ramp in the form of artifacts that you could utilize, but I mainly wanted to focus on the best of the best. In this deck, we want to flood the board with vampires and swing in for a huge amount of damage. Well, let's really take advantage of that and amplify the damage, whether we double the tokens with Anointed Procession, or when they enter the battlefield, we deal 1 damage to each opponent with War Leader's Call. Both of these are excellent options, mainly because we can flood the board, and when Edgar goes on the battlefield, we can buff up our huge giant army and swing potentially for victory. And with Anointed Procession, we get a double up on the effects, and with War Leader's Call, or even cards like Impact Tremors, we can really increase the damage input and really put the pressure on our opponent's life total. Another undeniable option would be Shared Animosity. For 2 and a red, it's an enchantment. Whenever a creature you control attacks, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each other attacking creature that shares a type with it. And of course, we're going with vampires. Let's just say we have 10 vampires on the battlefield and they all swing. Well, all your vampires are going to get +10/+0. And not only that, if Edgar's on the battlefield, he gets to buff up those vampires even further. This is one insane option that almost acts like a Crater Hoof depending on the right type of deck. In a similar fashion of buffing up your creatures, another option I did want to focus on is Banner of Kinship. This is a new card from the Foundation set. This essentially acts as a Crater Hoof on the battlefield. You pay 5 mana. As this artifact enters, choose a creature type. Obviously, you're going to be choosing Vampire. This artifact enters with a Fellowship counter on it for each creature you control with the chosen type. Creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1 for each Fellowship counter on this artifact. And what's very good about this card is the fact that if you get board wiped, the Fellowship counters still stand on the Banner of Kinship, so if you cast more vampires, they're still going to get that huge buff off of Banner Kinship. And another way you could seriously buff up all your vampires is using Cathar's Crusade. Even though I'm not a math expert, this is still a very good card because you'll have to do a lot of math with the amount of vampires are entering the battlefield and the amount of counters are spreading around all them. Because whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So if you have a couple vampires on the battlefield and then you cast another vampire, you're making the extra token copy. So not only are your vampires getting buffed up by one time, but they're getting buffed up by another time. So now that I've talked about some cards that really push the aggressive theme for your commander deck, I did want to talk about some vampires that will really help out your strategy and push you closer to victory. So the first vampire I did want to talk about is technically an honorary vampire. He is the son of Edgar Markov, and that's Soren, Imperi's Bloodlord. And I wanted to focus specifically on this version of Soren. The other versions are fine, however this one really helps out vampires a ton, and obviously it's a flavor one because obviously Soren is the son of Edgar, so he has to be in the deck. But not only that, he deals with vampires so effectively, and so effective in fact that he got banned in Pioneer because he enabled Vein Ripper to go onto the battlefield with that -3 ability so effectively instead of paying the mana cost for Vein Ripper, which I'll get into a little bit, but let's first talk about Soren and why he's so good in this deck specifically. For the +1, target creature you control gains Death Touch and Lifelink until end of turn. If it's a vampire, put a +1/+1 counter on it. The other +1 ability may sacrifice a vampire. When you do, Soren deals 3 damage to any target and you gain 3 life. And also that last ability with a -3, you may put a vampire creature card for your hand onto the battlefield. So again, this could essentially cheat a big giant splashy vampire like Vein Ripper onto the battlefield, which is another card that I think is perfect for this deck. It has flying, ward, sacrifice a creature. Whenever a creature dies, target opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So this is essentially a hulked out version of Blood Artist. Speaking of Blood Artist effects, of course we're going to add them into the deck because we do have a little bit of Aristocrats payoffs. So we could obviously use Blood Artist, Vengeful Blood Witch, or even Cruel Celebrant. Each of these, whenever a creature dies, you basically gain a life and an opponent will lose life. Obviously with Cruel Celebrant, it takes it a step further, which each opponent loses 1 life. Plus they are cheap and efficient, where again, when we're casting these for a low cost, we're getting an additional vampire on the battlefield, so this is a win-win either way. Another really good option, and honestly one that will really flood the board with vampires, maybe even more than Edgar himself, is Charismatic Conqueror. For 1 and a white, it has Vigilance, and whenever an artifact or creature enters the battlefield untapped under an opponent's control, they may tap that permanent. If they don't, you create a 1/1 white vampire creature token with lifelink. And this is extremely deadly in this deck because your opponents will have the hard choice. If they tap that permanent that entered the battlefield, they are vulnerable to other opponents and ourselves because we're going to be swinging at a lot of different people with our Vampire Legion. But if they don't tap that permanent, our vampire army will grow more and more. I did want to focus on some other vampires like Cordial Vampire and Captivating Vampire. Each of these are great because they essentially buff up our vampires. Cordial Vampire, whenever a creature dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. And with Captivating Vampire, it's basically an anthem for other vampires you control. But not only that, if you have a lot of tokens, you can tap 5 of them and gain control of another target creature and it becomes a vampire in addition to its other types. So that way this is basically thieving all your opponent's creatures. One other vampire that could really be a win con in this deck would be Sanctum Seeker. This is incredible because whenever a vampire you control attacks, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. That might not seem like a lot, but think about it this way. If you have 5 vampires, you're swinging at 1 opponent, each of them will trigger off a Sanctum Seeker. So basically you gain 5 life and each opponent loses 5 life. So this is just a pretty good way of closing out the game. But if you do want to add a combo in the deck, this is a pretty well-known combo. Obviously it gains with life loss and life gain, and that's Bloodthirsty Conqueror and Vito Thorn of the Dusk Rose. And I wanted to mention these two specifically because they're both vampires. You could obviously throw in some other ones like Exquisite Blood or Sanguine Bond into this deck that essentially do the same thing, but the fact that these are both vampires will help you close out the game for sure. Bloodthirsty Conqueror, whenever an opponent loses life, you gain that much life, so that's perfect because with the synergy of Vito, whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. So if you have these two on the battlefield and one opponent loses 1 life, you will start a chain reaction between the two of these where opponents will lose life, you gain life, and because you gain life, opponents will lose life back and forth until everybody's drained and you get victory that way. But now that is going to do it for me, guys. Thank you guys so much for coming by and watching this video on Edgar Markov. When I first started this channel, I didn't want to focus on a lot of popular commanders like Edgar Markov. However, because of the new reprint, I found it very fitting for me to make a deck tech out of it. But now I would love to hear from you. What are your thoughts and opinions about this video? And what other cards would you suggest for an Edgar Markov deck? I know I scratched the surface with this video talking about some vampires. There's plenty of other vampires that I could mention. These are just some of the ones that I feel personally are going to really make your Edgar Markov deck really powerful. Also, if you can, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. That's definitely one of the best ways in supporting the channel. And with that out of the way, thank you for stomping by.